You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, yeah.
I don't think the 60s would have happened, the music, the art, the literature, unless it was for LSD. Everybody took this pill and went on this big trip, and it changed their minds.
I'll never forget the first time I got high. It was like a revolution in my brain.
Timothy Leary said the wrong thing. He said, turn on, tune in, drop out. What was actually happening was turn on, tune in, take over.
Things just snowballed, having different ideas about respect for authority, different ideas about sex, and different ideas about drugs.
These battles are still being fought. This is not ancient history. This is stuff that's being fought out right now.
Break on through to the other side, 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 break on through, break on through, break on through, break on through.
Introducing the American way of life on the threshold of the golden 60s. Color, style, comfort, utility, and convenience. Recreation.
The 50s were so boring that something had to crack. We wore white t-shirts with nothing on them. Girls got kicked out of school if they wore pants to school. Everybody had the same haircut, and the culture was really boring. So we just collectively as a generation, I would say spontaneously, started experimenting with lifestyle and cultural changes.
Well, see, there were two 50s. There's the surface 50s of the Eisenhower and Levittown suburbs, Squaresville, but underneath it were beatniks. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, those beatnik writers, and the jazz musicians, Coltrane and Miles. Potheads and peyote heads seeking to break beyond the restrictions of that Eisenhower era into freedom.
One of the things that Kerouac, Burroughs, and Ginsberg were finding in drugs was something that was completely revolutionary to them. And that was how the experience of certain substances like marijuana and amphetamines could bring you more into the experience of the moment. They were trying to live exactly the way the jazz musicians were blowing.
Charlie Parker would get really high and then just go crazy, with the horn. Miles Davis later, all of these guys were heavy users. But the whole idea of how creativity was fueled, if you look at the beats, it changed the way they play with language.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix.
Allen Ginsberg used to speak of back of the brain imagery. How do you get in the back of your own brain? As long as there have been substances that allow you to make that trip, artists are going to be drawn to try to do it.
For that generation of kids that read On the Road, it was as if Jack Kerouac had written this Huckleberry Finn, but sent Huck and Jim down the river with a great big spliff of marijuana. And they couldn't wait to try it and go on the trip themselves.
We were an extension of the beatniks. These were our mentors. And the bridge, at least for me, and a lot of people, was folk music.
From the great Atlantic Ocean to the wide Pacific shore.
Folk music introduced a lot of us to authentic music and authentic voices, and it led you off the beaten path. Certainly when folk music was coming into fruition, so was marijuana. It was just something that freed up the senses.
Popular music changed very dramatically in the 60s, and drugs definitely were central to that change. There was a music writer back in the 60s named Al Aronowitz who was friendly with Bob Dylan and many, many other musicians, including the Beatles, and he introduced Bob Dylan to the Beatles at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. And in the song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Beatles are singing I Can't Hide. Dylan evidently thought they were saying I Get High. So he shows up at their hotel room with marijuana, and they all smoke it.
Well, Ringo started laughing. He just started laughing. He looked so funny. We all started laughing at the way he was laughing. And then we took turns laughing at everybody the way they were laughing. It just kept going around and around. I can't remember much else of the conversation.
This single experience would have worldwide repercussions because he got them all stoned. They talk about it quite openly. From that moment on, they were confirmed potheads. I mean, they were stoned for the whole experience of Beatlemania. In the mid-60s, a couple of factors become critically important to this story. One is the advanced guard of the baby boom generation is surging onto American campuses, and there are more potential pot smokers than ever before. Kids who aren't interested in civil rights and jazz and folk music and sexual liberation. You have the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964. In 1965, Johnson begins escalating American involvement in South Vietnam so quickly that to these kids who are going to be eligible for the draft, it begins taking on a sense of daily apocalypse. Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. Watts goes up in flames. The water is beginning to boil. And for these kids, smoking pot now begins to take on all different kinds of connotations. It becomes a whole cultural and political stance against something. It becomes connecting with like-minded people.
To John, his first pot party looks exciting. Everyone seems to be having fun. Best of all, there are no parents, no other adults, no one to interfere with the fun. John surrenders his dignity and lays his future on the chopping block. Not whether it's good or bad or right or wrong. But if he stopped to think, he would see the stupidity of it all. Now he's too involved to think. He's having kicks.
The anti-drug films from the 60s are some of the best movies ever made because those things that people might be smoking were sort of the equivalent of the Blob or the 50-Foot Woman.
Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell.
16 years old and a marijuana addict.
Yes, I remember. Just a young boy. Under the influence of the drug, he killed his entire family with an axe.
The movie Reefer Madness? First time I saw that, I mean, we laughed. We were high.
Master.
Need some more of that reefer. And you get maniacal, and the girls all of a sudden they're dancing. Oh, my God, it's ridiculous.
I think what happened is that if you took marijuana and you found out it was nothing like what was depicted in those movies, then you didn't believe any of the stories about things.
The kind of mythology that you always heard in the 50s and 60s was that, if you smoked pot, that would lead to heroin. But in fact, what it did lead to was really LSD. That psychedelic journey was available to you. The journey was a journey of the imagination. It wasn't an escape. It was, well, a trip.
3 drops of this colorless, odorless, tasteless liquid would put you out of your mind for hours, out of your normal mind into kinds of consciousness so fantastic, so self-revealing, so charged with emotion, that usually the first dose is the most profound experience in a lifetime, and sometimes the most shattering. This can be psychological dynamite.
Why would people do it? Because it's fun, because it's exciting, because it was dangerous, because your parents didn't want to do it, and because it was the new.
I took it the first time because I was curious.
Under LSD, God's not a faraway idea. He's something that's right inside you that you're experiencing now.
It really changed my whole life. I mean, it was the most fantastic thing that has ever happened to me.
LSD was first invented by Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, in 1938. And in 1943, he had a peculiar presentiment that something about that molecule deserved another look.
He was trying to find a treatment of migraines, so he ingested some, and when he really started feeling the effects of it, he got on his bike and he went riding off into the Swiss countryside for the first LSD trip in history. There were 2 interpretations of the meaning of LSD. The first came from the psychiatric community.
Back in the 50s and 60s, there was a large body of research, and tens of thousands of people underwent LSD psychotherapy with some good effects. And interesting patient populations, I mean, childhood autism and schizophrenia, certainly alcoholism and drug addiction.
Other people were aware that LSD could be stimulating creativity. And so there were a group of scientists that were doing low-dose LSD every once in a while and then working on intellectual problems. And Francis Crick was one of them. And it turns out that the day he had the vision of the double helix in 1953, one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century, the structure of DNA, was one of the days that he was experimenting with LSD.
The other interpretation and agenda was that what this stuff is insane.
It can produce suicide attempts, homicide attempts, appalling panic. It's a virtually indescribable panic that may last for a period of days or even weeks.
And that is precisely what attracted the spooks of the CIA.
Here is a group of normal soldiers responding to a series of routine drill commands. After receiving a small dose of LSD, they are confused and undisciplined.
At a certain point, the U.S. government became alarmed and thought that LSD was going to enable the Russians to come up with a truth serum, or that they would be able to use it as a weapon. So in the early 50s, the Central Intelligence Agency started a research program called MK-Ultra, looking into chemical weapons, biological weapons, and other kinds of unconventional weaponry. As part of this LSD experimentation, they would go into bars and they would squirt it into people's drinks, and then they would bring them back to a so-called safe house where they had one-way mirrors, and they would be behind that mirror making notes about how these people responded.
Reefer! You know what day it is today, Cap? Yeah. What? What day of the week? Wait a minute.
Around the time that the CIA is doing their mind control experiments, Timothy Leary was the faculty sponsor of research with psilocybin at Harvard.
Psilocybin was the synthetic extract of the psychoactive molecule magic mushrooms. And in the early 1960s at Harvard, Timothy Leary, this tweedy professor, started gathering these bright young scholars around him, and they began taking the substance.
The effect is somewhat like looking through a microscope. Suddenly, you discover that there's an invisible world around you that you hadn't known about before you did it. The same thing is true of a psychedelic drug. You're aware of processes that are going on inside your own brain.
Leary and his colleagues believed that psilocybin was revolutionary and that it could really remake human thought and society.
The doctors wouldn't like that because it would be throwing their game of medicine into dramatic revision. The ministers and priests wouldn't like it because there's a new conception of the divine process that's not in the Bible.
And suddenly the media had discovered this really interesting story. Students and teachers taking these wild, mind-altering drugs together, and it was very controversial.
Our aim, like the aims of any religious group just beginning, is to transform American society. It's an insane asylum over here, and it's our goal to lift the spiritual level of the American people. We're going to try to bring about a religious renaissance and a spiritual revolution.
Tim Leary sort of wanted everyone to have it, and he, to a large extent, was personally responsible for introducing psychedelics to, America at large.
I have to say, maybe I wouldn't have taken LSD if I hadn't have read his literature about it. He gave me some of the intellectual grounding to feel safe about it. Certainly among everyone I knew, there was a deep spiritual curiosity, and most people took their LSD trips seriously. And certainly those first couple of trips are mind-blowing. Suddenly you're seeing the effect of raw, unfiltered information coming in.
A lot of people were caught off guard by how powerful their LSD experiences were, both positive and negative, difficult and easy.
It's like playing with a shotgun, and personally, I don't want to die.
You completely lost all sense of being, and the only thing that you were conscious of was the barrage of the senses, the feeling of the brain with all the nerves sending barrages of experience into your brain, and the nerves going into the neck, and how the nicest thing that you could possibly think of would be to cut those nerves off, to cut off that experience, to die. It was 50-50. Half of it was very nice. The motto of our religion and what we're advising all Americans is turn on, tune in, and drop out. Now, this may sound rather shocking. Actually, this is the oldest religious metaphor and statement which teachers have passed on for thousands of years.
Tim Leary truly believed that these drugs could bring about a more direct access to the Godhead. At the same time, on the West Coast, you have this character, Ken Kesey, and he begins pursuing what is essentially the recreational sports approach to the psychedelic experience.
I've always thought that this is one of those things that proves that God has a sense of humor. That if Gabriel come up and says, hey, Chief, the Americans are really messed up down there. We're going to have to do something to straighten them out. They've got a nosedive karma going on. And God says, well, send them some of that stuff you've been working on, that acid stuff, and have the CIA distribute it. You can hear the celestial laughter.
Ken Kesey was a writer, and he was a student at Stanford, and he was part of experiments at the VA hospital there. For money, they could take these experimental drugs, including LSD.
And my metaphor for the thing was, it's as though these people had discovered a room, and they thought there was something in that room of value to them, but they didn't want to go in there. So they hired students to go in there, and after a number of those students came out with a wild look in their eye, they said, close up that room and don't let anybody else go back in that room. And that's when I found that my key fit the doctor's office and decided that this was too important a business to leave in the hands of the government.
It didn't take him long to figure out how to get his hands on it, and he got himself a job working the night shift at a psychiatric facility, and he would actually take the stuff during the night shift. That was where he got the idea for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. For him, being on this psychiatric ward under the effects of these chemicals was like someone ripping the veil away to peer into the darkness at the heart of the American soul. Kesey is essentially looking at American society as a loony bin.
Here was this tremendous work of art that was written partially under the influence of LSD and captured a lot of people's feelings about the spirit of the age and the need for this breakthrough through the freedom-loving spirit. And I think Ken was able, through that literature, to just motivate a lot of people. And personally, I'd say motivated me to try psychedelics.
The significant thing about Kesey, I think, is that The psychedelic experience really becomes, first and foremost, an adventure.
Ken Kesey, in the story told by Tom Wolfe in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, gathered his friends in a group that they called the Merry Pranksters, and as much LSD as they could put together, got in a bus that they called Further, and drove across the country experiencing America on acid.
This is the captain speaking. We are cruising at an altitude of 38,000 feet. Oxygen will not be necessary in the pressurized cabin.
To say that they were merely stoned would do a tremendous disservice to how stoned they really were.
Being assailed by a swarm of joints. So I'm trying to keep them flowing toward the front of the bus. Well, again, to the countryside.
Oh, yes, we are.
So I want to take some LSD. I want Babs to take some. Cassidy, you want to take some?
There was a kind of antic, surreal, fun quality to being these kind of psychedelic pranksters. It became a big joke on straight culture.
Sleep all day, drive all night. Brain my numb, can't stop now. For sure ain't no doubt. Keep open mind, let it all hang out.
When they were all high and they were all plugged in, it seemed like the bus became this one consciousness through space and light and time, and that was what they called group mind. And that was very much the concept that they were going after when they got back from the bus trip and they decided to begin the acid tests. Suddenly, these leaflets started appearing up and down the coast around the Bay Area with these cryptic words, "Can you pass the acid test?" And what the acid tests were was the first multimedia mass acid experience.
During the time that Kesey was experimenting with it, LSD was manufactured as a legal drug. So he became sort of the Pied Piper to the psychedelic culture that was growing up in the San Francisco area at that time.
The commencement exercises for LSDU will be held at Winterland on Monday night. That's Halloween. And, of course, the man who is going to be passing out the diplomas is Ken Kesey.
I knew that people were tired of the old concert form, and the acid test was, again, discovering what there was out there if you just continued to move away from the norm.
Are you going to tell what's bad about LSD?
Not necessarily.
Will
LSD be evidence at the graduation ceremony, Ken? Why don't you guys come? Yeah.
Some of that high-powered rocket fuel? Well, let me take a sip.
The acid tests were the hippest place to be at that time. People were just getting used to acid. There were light projections, and they were music, and they were people basically manifesting themselves, going dressed according to their own fantasies. And acid was the kind of lubricant that made it possible.
And then there was this group of musicians called the Warlocks. And of course, that was the Grateful Dead.
The nice thing about the acid test was that we could play or not. And a lot of times we would get we'd be too high really to play. And we'd play for maybe a minute. That's what we'd call it. And then we'd lose it, you know?
Kesey and the Pranksters really created the blueprint of the psychedelic counterculture. And at the same time, you had this budding community of like-minded people. And it all just began to coalesce and combusted.
This is some potion that is young lady giving me, and it feels pretty good.
You can't really understand the peaking of drugs in the 60s counterculture without looking at the experience of the Haight-Ashbury.
Well, I came to San Francisco and I moved into the Haight-Ashbury. There was nothing there. And then one day I saw this new shop called the Psychedelic Shop. And that was the first overt clue that something was happening in that neighborhood that was of a countercultural aspect.
By 65, 66, you have this community that has its own hip stores and merchants, and this psychedelic philosophy.
Look around you, nothing works. The only thing the kid is presented with is when you grow up, look, you know, you can join the army, you can go to war, you can get a gig working as an engineer and become a vegetable and drive to work in your own car, your own big metal box. And, you know, just, it looks absurd. You know, people in their metal boxes like this going all over from job to job, frustrated, uptight. What joy is there in life? Life is and should be ecstasy.
There's a pretty young lady right there.
In 1965, when I went to San Francisco, it was exciting because there was music coming from windows and people that you could, you know, stop and talk to that you didn't know, you'd never met before, and it was just that sort of breakdown of all the sort of constraints of people getting together.
You know, it was real. You talk to anyone who was there at the time, and the thing that strikes you about it is the sincerity of it. It existed. They took care of each other. You have the Diggers, this core group of community activists creating these community-wide psychedelic events and happenings and experiences. If you needed clothes, you walked into the Digger Free store and could pick out something you wanted. It was like Nirvana.
I'm free! There was a group called the Diggers, who were basically improv actors who had gotten really into the Haight-Ashbury. They did all these theatrical things which were intended to turn people into little centers of anarchist activism. I'm free!
We didn't want to be communists. We didn't want to be capitalists. They were not going to let us live authentically. We wanted to be who we were and then create a culture which would have space for us. Drugs factor into this in a couple ways. Acid so wipes out your preconditioning that for people like us, it seemed like a way to make sure that we were not just thinking within the box and recombinating the pieces.
Every afternoon at 4, hungry hippies begin to congregate in the Panhandle. They are waiting for the arrival of the Diggers, a hippie subgroup who show up at this time with a station wagon full of food, which is given free to anyone who wants it.
We just wanted to change the frame of reference to say, it's free, it's yours. What are you going to do with it? We were trying to take people to relook at their life without their personal history. You know, Dylan named it in Like a Rolling Stone. How does it feel to be on your own, like a complete unknown with no direction home, like a rolling stone? Everybody knew what he meant, so that the hate itself became a stage for people to invent themselves, to act out the role of their own hero. We used to say, don't be lonesome for your heroes. Be your own hero.
The nice thing about Haight-Ashbury, we see nice old Victorian houses in huge places, and you get 10 people in a place, and all these people from all over were loving this stuff. And the Al Daniels and the Diggers, and the guys from the Beat generation, Allen Ginsberg, and all those kind of guys, in and out. You know, I mean, the whole scene was alive. I mean, the things that happened in our house, there was endless numbers of things.
Looking for a house one time, and my realtor, who was related to somebody in the dead, invited me to this party, and she said, but don't come unless you're willing to be dosed. It's like the acid and the squirt guns, the people who could, like, hit your Dixie cup from 20 feet, you know. There's an art form.
This is the house of a popular local band which plays hard rock music. They call themselves the Grateful Dead.
What we're thinking about is a peaceful planet. We're not thinking about anything else. We're not thinking about any kind of power. We're not thinking about any of those kind of struggles. We're not thinking about revolution or war or any of that. That's not what we want. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to hurt anybody. We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life, you know, and like think about moving the whole human race ahead a step or a few steps.
Do you think that your movement or your idea, the hip idea, is essentially connected up with drugs?
Yeah, I would say that's a large part of the framework.
I think that most of the people who are hippies now came to it through drugs.
Yeah, but it's not a dope movement. We're not trying to spread dope.
I think, personally, that the more people turn on, the better world it's going to be.
What happened in the Haight-Ashbury had a lot to do with the fact that in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was already a tradition of taking psychedelics. There were some people who actually made some, but they were always thinking small. They were always thinking, basically, I don't want to get busted. In the spring of 1964, I was living at a weird little rooming house in Berkeley, and this guy named Owsley Stanley moved in. He's a very extraordinary guy. He had paintings. He was a ballet dancer. He had a complete beekeeping costume. He was also a trained blacksmith. He was different from a lot of the other people who got into psychedelics who said, boy, you could make this stuff, that would be cool. Owsley's way of thinking was to do things boldly. So he just went out there and bought raw lysergic acid in large quantities. Huge quantities. He made several million doses of LSD. So the San Francisco scene became basically the biggest LSD party in history.
This hippie girl may be giving people free doses of LSD. The word on the street is that Owsley Stanley is the entrepreneur who is responsible for this. Needless to say, he keeps a low profile and does not like to have his picture taken. Here he is, the Acid King. Owsley Acid has helped make Haight-Ashbury the LSD capital of the world.
The largest manufacturer of LSD in the country. They passed 3 separate laws against what he was doing. They were actually known as the Owsley laws.
LSD was declared illegal in October of 1966. 3 months later, you have a major psychedelic event in San Francisco. The first human being, the gathering of the tribes. 30,000 people streaming into Golden Gate Park on a beautiful day, all of them taking acid.
Turn on, tune in, drop out.
It was astounding to see all of ourselves. It must be like a Jew going to Israel for the first time, and suddenly you're inside. Instead of being an outsider, everyone's like you.
I remember imagining that I was part of a gathering of Viking princes.
The diggers were handing out LSD by the shovelful. Allen Ginsberg was probably doing Shiva chant, but we couldn't tell. We were all just there stoned out of our gourds on acid.
It's not even like today where you pay $40 and you go to a rock and roll show and you watch somebody acting out canned rebellion. Like everyone else, it confirmed my instinct that something was going on. We weren't just imagining it.
There's a period in the mid-60s where drugs become a critical element in the whole explosion of the pop music culture.
Music was the soundtrack to the whole thing, and in some cases, it was what was stirring the pot. It was all about altered states, states of ecstasy. It was approximating the drug experience.
The San Francisco sound was basically the music that was produced by guys who had a lot of time and a lot of drugs and were trying to recreate their experiences in music. Country Joe, the Quicksilver Messenger Service, the Grateful Dead, the Ace of Cups, which was an all-girl band, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and Janis. You know, these were our people. This was our community.
Yeah, the San Francisco bands had a new kind of style. It was basically a style of acid heads talking to acid heads. And one of the things that was happening that was so exciting is that we seemed to be getting validation from the London scene. There was a kind of an international rock and roll psychedelic community. And then we started getting direct confirmation from the Beatles, which first we scarcely dared imagine. The Beatles were the most famous celebrities in the world. and they were doing the same stuff we were. And Owsley, of course, says he gave them some of his acid.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
Well, 4 times.
And where did you get it from?
So, you know, I mean, if I was to say where I got it from, you know, it's illegal and everything. It's silly to say that, you know, so I'd rather not say that.
By that time, they were stars, they had access to the media, and they became the expression of the counterculture to the mainstream.
1, 2, 3, ah!
People assumed, of course, that a song like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds had to do with LSD because of images like tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Lennon denied that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was specifically about LSD, but nobody believed him.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
The Beatles went from wearing suits to wearing dashikis and Nehrus in the matter of like 3 years.
You know, you saw it start to happen to them, and it was like, oh my God, my favorite band is on acid. That was only the beginning of it.
Monterey embodies what passes in California for tradition. So when the citizens learned Monterey was to be the scene of the first annual International Pop Festival, they were somewhat less than overjoyed. Police are worried about the use of marijuana and LSD. The performers are some of the biggest names in pop music today. And to those in their 40s and 50s who fondly remember Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey, the names may sound bizarre. There's Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jimi Hendrix, Country Joe and the Fish, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and the Grateful Dead.
June of 1967, Sgt. Pepper has been released. It's playing from every window, and the entire music industry is gathering for this event, the International Monterey Pop Festival.
All of the musicians from all over the world came. No one refused. And it was the first international platform for a lot of the San Francisco groups, and everyone was stoned out of their minds, and it was just a crazy event.
Everyone is converging in this one place. It becomes the nexus of this whole movement that's been building for the last 2 years. And Owsley shows up, and he has concocted a batch of acid specially for this event called Monterey Purple, and he's passing it out to everyone, and everyone is getting psychedelic. The moments at Monterey in which some of these performers were discovered, they became really epiphanies. Janis Joplin singing Ball and Chain. Hendrix. No one even knew who Hendrix was. Hendrix took 2 hits of Monterey Purple before he even walked out on stage. So whatever he did out on that stage, he was in a highly psychedelicized state. It's just remarkable to think about Hendrix being that high as he was playing, and then think about all the people out in the audience being in that same state. It just was unprecedented. Suddenly, these record companies began rushing over themselves to sign these bands. There was money to be made in psychedelic music, and all of these groups got record deals as a result of that event.
There was a kind of sense that musicians had become the new leaders, people who were in touch with something, and they were putting out maps of how to live and what was possible, maps of possibility. You know, what's the next stage of the journey? There was this feeling for a while, like everything is possible.
And I think that pop musicians in today's generation are in a fantastic position. They could rule the world, man. Music is the whole thing, man. It's an expression of the younger generation.
Music is only the beginning. By 1967, psychedelic drugs are shaping American popular culture. And the bigger it gets, the more it starts making people nervous. To the Americans of traditional values, this looked like nothing less than the end of civilization as they knew it.
It's easy for you to stand there with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in another and tell us not to blow pop.
You think we're stupid? Maybe you're right. But does that make your generation so all-fired smart for getting hung up on grass?
The result was conflict, counter-reaction, culture war.
We've shared the ups.
You are my family.
And the downs.
You're gonna put this on national television! You!
At last, the time has come for Chris and Adrian to say, I do. It's the wedding we've all been waiting for.
She's the love of my life.
Please join us for this very special VH1 event. My Fair Brady, the wedding special, premieres this Sunday at 9 on VH1.
Older people worry. They see the way you're dressed. They hear your music. They don't understand it. Do parents have anything to worry about?
I think so. Their children are doing things that they didn't do and they don't understand.
In the 60s, people took drugs to get out of their head, to get out of the constraints of society, and everybody was interested in finding out what life really is about. In the end, what happened as drugs became real popular is that psychedelic revolution became big business in the mass media.
The counterculture of the 60s exploded in full view of America, and once it exploded, the cat was out of the bag.
If there are 100,000 and 10,000 get involved in helping the other 90,000, that'll be their summer school. And they're going to all go back to their towns. And when they do, they're going to turn on everybody, and this thing is going to be all over the country.
And then when it happened, the establishment said, we can't make these changes. This threatens our very existence. We've got to do something about this.
The counterculture was free, and with its peculiar genius to turn everything into commodities, America commodified it. They turned it into records, films, fashion, magazines, because there's nothing that can't be bought or sold that can't be commodified in America.
It all moved in concert, really. The music industry, Hollywood, the media. Suddenly, the psychedelic style began to spread.
1967 is called a Summer of Love. It was like mainly based in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Now that spreads all across America. Everybody had taken the psychedelic substances.
You're out if you're not in, a be-in, the recurring theme of which is love one another. Seattle's be-in is the latest chapter of fresh air frolics, perfect for group therapy. Cape Cod hippies conduct a paint-in.
In 1967, be-ins start cropping up in cities all across the United States, and you have what appears to be the worldwide flowering of a psychedelic culture. And the next critical factor is the role that pop music begins to play in all of this.
But what happened in the 60s was access to media like young people had never had before. And part of that was music. And so the messages in the music, many of them were subtly or not so subtly about drugs.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small.
There were a number of bands that were fairly popular, but the first big hit band was Jefferson Airplane. They had a song called White Rabbit, which was an elaborate reading of Alice in Wonderland as kind of a metaphor for a psychedelic trip. And everybody thought, sure, yeah, that makes sense.
Just had some kind of mushroom, and your mind is...
You listen to a song like White Rabbit, Grace singing Feed Your Head. To anyone who had a clue of what was going on, it was a clarion call.
suddenly on the airwaves of AM radio, going from coast to coast, were messages encouraging people to try drugs.
Some hippies believe the greatest allies they have in spreading dope throughout this country are the mass media of this country. Every day the radio plays drug music, Get Yourself a Little Green, Day Tripper. The teenagers get the message from these. They know that green is marijuana, a trip is a drug experience.
Suddenly there's a song on the radio, San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. And the next message goes out, everyone come to San Francisco because you're going to meet some very gentle people.
If you're going to San Francisco.
The picture that kids all across the country got was that there was this great big party and they'll take care of you. It will be this community where you will be embraced and loved and so forth. And the place was just inundated.
100,000 is a minimum estimate of what's happening. I think it's be a major historical event for this country, what is going to happen. San Francisco can, if you will, become a holy city.
All across the nation.
It just burst at the seams. There was just no way for it to assimilate all the people who were coming along. The result of it was it brought an immense amount of attention to the Haight-Ashbury. All of a sudden, every newspaper, every TV station in the country was flooding the place with reporters.
CBS News, without any flowers in its hair, is in San Francisco because this city has gained the reputation of being the hippie capital of the world. We're asking whether any central idea unites the hippie colonies in this and other cities, whether they have anything to tell us, why there is so much emphasis on the use of the drug LSD in their philosophy. Now, at this point, we're going to leave Golden Gate Park to go into and take a slight sojourn through the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. It is the belief of the people who live within the area that we, the middle class or the upper class, have done a very, very poor job in running our government and our way of life.
We woke up one morning and there was the Gray Lines tour bus out in front of our house. I mean, then it got really strange.
You're going to be educated now.
Speed, combination of heroin and methadone, producing a speedy, powerful high. Split as a lead. Stoned, high as on LSD.
The thing exploded pretty rapidly after that. I mean, it was exhilarating to be there at the explosion, but it did explode.
We've got this survival school here where the new kids coming to Haight Street can really find out where it's at. Sex, drugs, VD, how to avoid getting busted for drugs, how to avoid gang bangs and pregnancy, how to exist without bread. We give out 6 months of experience in 3 days.
To say that the Summer of Love turned out to be a cruel sham would be one way of describing it, but, it's not as simple as that. First of all, you have this small neighborhood and 250,000 kids descending on it. And then you have crime, have the appearance of hard drugs, amphetamine, heroin.
How long is he going to be out?
I don't know. It depends on how much he did up. If that's what he did, I don't know.
The ordinary seasonal supply of marijuana had dried up, and the scene had gotten so crowded that people didn't want to take acid and go out on the street. And to deal with the pressure of all these masses of people there, some people started taking speed. These guys basically kind of pushed everybody else off the street. I mean, who would want to be on the street with a bunch of crazy speed freaks running around? And I mean, crazy? I mean, when I moved to the Haight-Ashbury, you never saw cats on the street because speed freaks were catching them and eating them. That's kind of what happened.
When the truth is found to be lies, and all the joy within you dies. Don't you want somebody?
The hippies weren't hippies behind closed doors. Hippies were hippies in plain sight. So they were a delight to a lot of the young people, but they came to the attention of the authorities immediately. The music was louder than anything we heard. It was more overtly sexual. It was always in the act of declaring itself. So they were something that conservatives and older people could use to scare the votes in. They seemed godless and communistic, and so politicians like Ronald Reagan were able to make hay by pitting themselves against the hippies.
You know, we have some hippies out there in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. One of them the other day was giving some advice to his companions. He said, you know, your parents take care of you till you're 21. The government takes care of you after you're 65. You've only got 44 lousy years. You got to look out for yourself. This fella that was doing the talking had a haircut like Tarzan. He walked like Jane and smelled like Cheetah.
But whatever they tried to do, you know, the establishment would turn out to be like somebody trying to stick their finger in a dike that was about to explode.
Marijuana. I think it's great. First off, I've been smoking it about 10 years. I find that it's good for some things, not good for others.
There was a kind of mainstreaming of drugs in the 60s. It became something that was out there. But eventually, as the underground began to penetrate the mainstream, you know, there began to be a reaction.
The courts today are crowded with young offenders. Is the gamble of drug exploration worth this?
Hey, Jerry! You got a
Police officer, open the door.
No one has the right to tell me what I can do with my own body, what I can eat, drink, or smoke.
If you don't like what these kids are saying and doing, then you go after their leaders. And who were their leaders? Kesey and Alpert and Metzner and Ginsburg and Leary.
The kids who take LSD aren't going to fight your wars, middle-class, middle-aged, whiskey-drinking generals. They're not going to join your corporations, middle-class, middle-aged, whiskey-drinking corporation presidents.
Something happened that would change Leary's life forever, and that was he was busted for marijuana. And from that moment on, he was vulnerable. And so the more the government came after him and tried to stick it to him, the more he felt the need to create this alliance, the psychedelic movement as he envisioned it. He truly believed in the potential of the psychedelic experience, but it was also warfare. He was facing decades in jail.
Sock it to me. Come on. You can't hurt me.
Leary saw so much propaganda coming back the other way that I think he felt that it was all right to engineer some propaganda of his own.
Don't vote, don't go to school, drop out of school, because schools, education today, is the worst narcotic drug of all. Our avowed aim is, of course, to bring down the American empire.
Tim Leary was busted. They thought, we'll bust the high priest, we'll throw him in prison. And the federal judge in California that judged his case called him, and I quote, the most dangerous man in America.
The polarization of the culture became much, much clearer. And when somebody like Paul McCartney, you know, starts talking publicly about taking LSD, musicians start getting arrested.
I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, you know, on television.
You got to pick up every stitch. Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch, yeah. Must be the season of the witch.
The most famous person I almost arrested was Mama Cass. They were in town, and there were a bunch of kids going out to see them, and my informant was one of them, and they were allegedly going to have a party after the concert, and they were going to be giving acid to everybody, and I just never got it to the party. Had I would have been the first one to arrest Mama Cass Elliot.
I think what they're worried about is an entire alternative set of values that is being offered that negates most of their set of values. I'm talking about the power structure here.
There was a very clear sense of us and them. And eventually you have things like the Doors are going to perform Light My Fire on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they get asked to delete the word higher.
1967. Ed Sullivan was the #1 show in America and one of the only places to see rock and roll. Light My Fire is the #1 song in America, and the Doors are invited. 15 minutes before showtime, somebody comes into the dressing room and says to us, we have a problem, boys. Network won't let you say higher on national television. And Jim said to him, what are we supposed to say? And he looks at Jim and he said, well, you're the poet. Why don't you come up with something? Wire, flyer, and Jim's about to hit the guy. And I grabbed his hand and said, no, for God's sake. So I said to the man, okay, listen, here's what we're going to do. We will change the lyric. And he said, okay, I knew you were the sensible one. That's good. He walks out the door. Jim and John and Robbie come to me and say, we're not changing the lyric. I said, exactly.
And the media is in the business of news. But when it became really big news and then everybody jumped on the bandwagon, then it became a problem for the authorities, the status quo. Because a lot of what was happening in the counterculture was actually illegal.
Shows like Dragnet became perfect for exploiting the drug culture. Dragnet was being produced at the same time as the hysteria about LSD was peaking. So there are episodes of Dragnet that are ripped right from the headlines. The episode of the Blue-Faced Boy was ripped directly from the Watts acid test.
Dragnet, which is probably the most famous anti-drug television show. It's very funny to watch them now because they were so stilted and they were so self-righteous. You know, it was kind of disinformation, and everyone grew up laughing at it. See, that's what told you that drugs were okay.
These rumors about LSD, you would stare at the sun until your retinas burned out. It caused gruesome chromosome breakage and caused people to have horribly deformed babies.
Evil! Evil! Evil!
Come on! What Dragnet did was it took every hysterical myth about drugs that had been around since the 1930s, slapped it onto the psychedelic culture, and just magnified it 100-fold.
Don't you people know where your baby is?
Gene, where's Robin?
Robin!
There's a whole other thread to this story, which is that the explosion of interest and use of marijuana and psychedelics had an enormous impact on the burgeoning anti-war movement. The anti-war movement was reaching a crossroads in 1967. The war was escalating. There was something like 500 servicemen coming back in body bags every month. And the whole thing began taking on this dire sense of an apocalypse. In the wake of the human being, there emerged a contingent of psychedelic activists who were determined to rescue the anti-war movement from what they saw as the boring and predictable tactics of the old left.
Political pigs, your days are numbered. We are the second American Revolution. We are winning. Yippee!
I think the anti-war movement would have happened without drugs. I think drugs would have happened without the anti-war movement. But together they were sympathetic partners.
The action that was planned for the first mobilization, the MOB as it was called, was designed to be something called the levitation of the Pentagon. The idea was the Pentagon was a symbol of evil. The demonstrators would join hands around it, and through chanting and all sorts of supernatural powers, they would lift the Pentagon off the ground and exorcise the dark forces from it. How psychedelic is that concept?
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. Some 400 demonstrators are arrested.
Flower power really began on the steps of the Pentagon. These people showed up at the demonstration with these masses of flowers, and they ended up in the barrels of those young soldiers on the steps of the Pentagon. Those were the images that went around the world.
Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another.
This whole sensibility of the flower as this symbol of what this movement was supposed to represent came directly out of the psychedelic experience.
The political energy of the 60s, you know, Vietnam protests, civil rights protests, began to converge with the kind of cultural utopianism of the counterculture, much of which was the product of drugs, you know, this sense of, you know, a new vision of a new world.
I think the drugs and the war were hand in hand in the sense that those that stayed behind were both unsettled, disturbed by what was going on, felt powerless. And one of the ways to check out in a very obvious and clear way is, you know, with your appearance, but also with drugs. You literally are checking out. And I think drug use, we all find, when do you want to reach for that? Usually when you're feeling pressured and stressed and you can't escape your life. Well, right then, young Americans couldn't escape the reality that the older generation was sending them off to a feudal war.
Why shouldn't I smoke crack? Why shouldn't I live now and have all the fun I can? If I don't get killed in the war or by the big bomb, all I can look forward to is making money like my father, and I know he isn't happy.
In their gut, the policymakers, the two things they were afraid of was this is becoming a white problem, and this is leading to kids being against what we believe, which at that time was the Vietnam War.
This year I will propose a Drug Control Act to provide stricter penalties for those who traffic in LSD and other dangerous drugs with our people. The time has come to stop the sale of slavery to the young.
Lyndon Johnson made the decision that marijuana use equated to anti-Vietnam. So it no longer was, what is this drug marijuana? What does it do? How should we handle it? It was, they are the enemy.
Right now it's time to take out the dance.
for that whole sense of we're going to stop the war and we can do it. That's 60s. I think the beginning of the end is in 1968 at the Democratic Convention.
There were reports in the underground press that LSD would be put in the water system and threats of disruption of the city itself. Things such as nude-ins, public fornication, and so forth.
Despite the behavior of Chicago police, yippie spirits remained high.
It was one of the first spectacles of cops really violently attacking young demonstrators.
The Festival of Life, as they called it, which turned out to be the festival of getting the kicked out of you.
It was just another example of what was going on in America that was wrong. And as a generation, young people disagreed with it.
All of this plays right into the hands of the government and the discrediting of the drug culture at the end of the 1960s. But by that point, the story of how drugs proliferate in American culture is largely the story of how they become hip and cool.
One of the interesting things is that the same values that were going on in the counterculture were actually going on in parts of corporate America, and particularly on Madison Avenue.
Cultural revolution and political revolution don't necessarily go together. And what happened was that the psychedelic revolution was so quickly co-opted by Madison Avenue that the counterculture became the mainstream culture. In other words, the Pepsi revolution.
We saw the counterculture being marketed almost immediately. As soon as there were kids visiting secondhand stores and the girls were wearing old granny dresses and rimless glasses and army boots, it was in vogue within a year.
I saw a 7-Up billboard that was painted by, I guess, Peter Max when he was under the Yellow Submarine influence. It just seemed that Peter Max, Yellow Submarine, LSD converged to seep into Madison Avenue, and then it just exploded all over the culture.
Hey, son of a gun! It's refreshment time!
What did the people in the counterculture want? They wanted change of style. They wanted the new. They wanted revolution for the hell of it. And what did people in Madison Avenue want? They wanted ever new products and ever new desires and new pleasures and revolution for the hell of it.
Look at us. Lemon cords, khaki denim, coral bells. Levi's jeans have variety.
Well, there's our chameleon model.
And they were putting those same values in advertisements for things like the Volkswagen Beetle.
The style spread very rapidly. By the end of 1967, there was a brand of soap that was being marketed to hippies. You know, you're not hung up on cleanliness, but here's a soap for you with a sort of a psychedelic package.
In dial antiperspirant. Then it began to move in various different ways. There started to be tongue-in-cheek and not so tongue-in-cheek jokes about marijuana on the Smothers Brothers show.
Here's one I put in before the show to show you, and I guess I let it get a little too high. But that never hurts, does it?
Media, music, film, television, all of these things are going through radical transformations in the 60s. And, you know, drugs were part of that scene.
See through this acid head's eye and flip out to oblivion with this cat. Get hip with this psychedelic chick. This is where it's at, man. This picture is now. Riot with out-of-sight cats and long hairs at Pandora's Box on Sunset Strip in Hollywood.
Hollywood occupies a unique place in this story and always has, because you have these young, hip actors there.
We were a group of actors who all hung out together, and the drugs were so taken for granted. Everybody was kind of stoned, but they could handle it.
She's a runaway. The cops are flashing her picture.
Jack Nicholson took acid during that time and talked about it quite candidly later on, and he became very interested in writing a movie about the psychedelic experience. And that's how he came to write The Trip. The Trip was really the first time that anyone actually tried to write a dramatic movie about an LSD experience.
I remember being 15 or 16 and having this movie come out in which Peter Fonda scores some acid and has this trip. They were trying to portray what he went through. I mean, I remember looking at this orange.
It gives off an orange cloud of light that just flows right out of the city.
I remember thinking, nice try. You know, it's really very hard to get this information into a film.
Suddenly, you have films that in one way or another are reflecting, you know, the drug culture. And at the end of the 60s, there's a kind of underlying sadness and tragedy about the utopian possibilities of the drug culture. So eventually, because the drug culture reflects the culture at large, you're suddenly seeing, you know, things like Easy Rider. In Easy Rider, the drugs are part of the storyline, but also there's an element of danger, not just in the drug life, but in the culture at large surrounding these characters.
I wanted to basically make a movie about what was happening in America at that moment. You know, I feel that we're going into a period of time now where it's like the McCarthy hearings. I mean, all the SDS leaders are being arrested, and the Black Panthers are being arrested, and the hippie leaders are being arrested. And
the other aspect of Easy Rider, as it relates to drugs, of course, is about pot.
Oh, no thanks. I got some store-bought right over here in the room.
No, man. This is grass.
Lord have mercy. Is that what that is? Well, let me see that.
Everything else before that, it just seemed like somebody would say, would you like a stick of marijuana, and hand it to a person? Whereas in Easy Rider, the drugs were just there. And that's what it was like.
You know I smoked a lot of grass.
They made this movie for no money, and it made like $45 million in the first summer. And it just turned Hollywood on its ear.
The public, though, I think, went for the picture because they felt we were up to something real. But beyond, yeah, we're really smoking dope. Yeah, it's really this. And yeah, we're really riding the motorcycles and we're not on a trailer and a traveling car and so forth.
The protagonists being so-called hippies gave a perception of it that went beyond what people had seen slightly on television and in print. Here was a feature film that everyone had access to that redefined how these people think and talk and went beyond the cliches. There was some kind of element to it sociologically that glorified and justified the use of drugs. I think that caused a lot of problems for some people.
It did glamorize it. It showed for the first time that people could smoke marijuana and do cocaine and not go out and kill a bunch of nurses. That was one side of it. On the other side of it, at the end, when Peter says to me, you know, we blew it. What that means to me at that time when I wrote that was that we blew our inheritance because we went for the criminal way, the easy way of access to things, and that we were really actually blowing our inheritance, which is freedom.
It was a strange movie because there was that sense that a revolution already had begun with a confession of failure, and the confession of failure, maybe not for filmmakers, but for the counterculture, I think turned out to be the prophetic part of it.
By August of 1969, the psychedelic culture had been in place for 3 to 4 years. Now there was a whole new wave of kids. And for these kids, in terms of like the psychedelic ideal, Woodstock would be the ultimate be-in. 500,000 people, everyone knew how high everyone was, and nothing bad happened.
Here we go.
Marijuana, LSD, and heroin were sold and taken openly at the festival, but police made no arrests. It was believed that a large percentage of the audience had taken some kind of drug.
In terms of the public mind, it was still a story about marijuana and psychedelics. And at Woodstock, the message was, not only is it fine, but it works. Look how it's sort of midwife this beautiful utopian experience, this new Woodstock nation. Of course, that would change quickly enough with Altamont, wouldn't it?
Altamont is a free concert given as a response to Woodstock in Northern California. On the advice of the Grateful Dead, they had the Hells Angels do security for the event. There was beer, there was drugs of all sorts, mayhem in the audience. The Hells Angels fought with people throughout the entire show. And at one point, someone appeared to point a gun at the stage, and the Hells Angels stabbed him to death. And that seemed to be a death knell for that innocent part of the 60s.
Brothers and sisters, come on now. That means everybody just pull out.
Altamont was one of these things where the downside of what the drug culture could be became very apparent. Is this where you end up? The Hells Angels, drunk on wine and taking pills, are now your police force? Here are these visionaries like Mick Jagger, the Jefferson Airplane, Keith Richards. They can't control this, so who is the authority here? Who is going to run this new community? So the sense of failure that Altamont seemed to represent was devastating.
What happens in the 60s. The whole thing falls apart when Manson enters the scene.
I don't think anyone was prepared for the savagery of those murders. Sharon Tate butchered when she was pregnant. The next series of murders, Rosemary LoBianco left with a fork sticking out of her abdomen. You know, as the details started to emerge, it was just grisly. It was the worst nightmare of the psychedelic counterculture.
The appearance of Charlie Manson and his cult murderers, who said they were taking some of their messages from the Beatles, showed the dark side of drug use, that it could be destructive, it could be murderous, it could ruin lives, and it unleashed passions that we didn't necessarily want unleashed.
There was a fundamental innocence about the psychedelic culture that was uniquely and profoundly vulnerable to someone like Charlie Manson. It's known that Manson took acid when he was in the Haight-Ashbury. It's known that it had an enormous impact on him. It's known that Manson gave his followers acid frequently. So there were many questions raised by Manson that the counterculture had to look at that were very difficult. How could it have happened that these chemicals that were supposed to be about opening of consciousness, taking care of people, creating community, have turned into tools for a malevolent individual to control people and mold them into killers? It was the last thing that they ever expected.
This is one of our own. We had hopes for everybody. Everybody is going to be part of this great revolution. Criminals, it doesn't matter. Uneducated, educated, that has nothing to do with it. We're all spiritual God. But guess what? There's a madness. There's a madness in human beings. And sometimes that LSD will bring that out. That's what we learned. LSD is not the ultimate panacea.
So when did the 60s end? Well, you have Woodstock, Altamont, the Manson murders, and then You have the deaths of Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison, all at the age of 27, as if they're all on the same lethal timetable. These people who had stood for opening up the soul and consciousness of the age, they were suddenly gone.
Bye, 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 baby, bye-bye. I may be seeing you around.
There was this great slogan in the 60s, it was like better living through chemistry. The metaphors abound for how to get your consciousness into new terrain, and one of the simplest ways of doing it is to take a drug, but one of the simplest ways to keep it from happening is to go on taking that drug over and over again. This is a question of amount, it's a question of degree. Too much is too much.
Obviously, when you heard about famous people, celebrities succumbing to drug use and dying as a result of it, that was a wake-up call for everybody. But if you look at really where those people were at, it was alcohol and hard drugs.
There was this magic time when taking drugs really did elevate your consciousness and made you do things better. I think that was very short-lived, and a lot of those people died of those drugs. Of course, as a culture, we want to have great music and great things, and do we really care how anybody makes us? Not really. Not really. We don't really care.
The Queen died, the Prince died, and the ultimate musician died. And the government shot everybody down at Kent State. And that was the end of it. Goodbye, idealism. But for a brief moment in time, there was a glimpse of what America could be. Love, love, love. That's what was going on in America.
So for the love generation, the power of these substances was that they really opened you and showed you that things don't have to be as fixed as you thought they were. And that meant musically, culturally, politically, sexually, personally, emotionally, spiritually. It meant across the board. So the overall impact of drugs on culture was complex and profound. But now you had something that had never really happened before in history. You had 10 million people who had used psychedelic drugs, over 20 million people smoking pot. Now you had a mass commercial drug culture flourishing in the United States.
VH1 You Ought to Know, introducing you to artists on the rise. An enchanting British songbird.
Three little birds sat on my window.
Corinne Bailey Rae captivates with a blend of delicate purity and soulful warmth.
It's about finding your identity in music.
VH1 presents Corinne Bailey Rae.
I think music's really powerful for that. It can find you a little world. You can make your own world.
For more on Corinne Bailey Rae and other You Ought to Know artists, go to VH1.com.
Just take a joint like this. Another person comes up to you.
And they blow on that, and they blow all the smoke into your lungs.
And you can take it through the nose, too.
Really? What does that do for you?
You cop a super rush, because it's a lot bigger than a toke. And the fire can go in your mouth, and it hurts.
But you think it's worth it?
Yeah.
In the 60s, you have a lot of bright young pennies with a somewhat political agenda. And then the 70s come in, and I think the drugs changed and the music changed, where the 60s seemed to be more sleek, like this is for your head. Take this, then read this. The 70s seemed to me, take this and we'll like laugh and fall over and like, out.
Dude, if you wanted to do a first acid trip, this would be a great place to do it.
When you took acid in the late 60s, you were expected to have a religious experience. When you took acid in the 70s, you were just loaded.
Hey, man. Am I driving okay?
I think we're parked, man.
Drugs seemed all-pervasive at moments in the 70s. There was a sense in which anything could be gotten at any time, anywhere, for no particular reason other than, you know, you want to feel good.
How do I feel? Great.
In the late 60s, early 70s, there was some real points of disillusion. The revolution had played itself out, and the drug culture went from we're all in this together to I don't know. There was just a big I don't know.
It's no longer about expanding the mind. It's no longer about those ideals. It's no longer about that psychedelic transcendentalism. Now it's going to be about getting stoned, ripped, twisted. In the 60s, you have to remember that the drug culture was bound up with a tremendous amount of idealism. It was about something larger than yourself. The irony for so many people was that a lot of the drugs that we took to create those openings were changed as time went on to other drugs, whether cocaine or heroin.
There was a huge explosion of the rock hero. Maybe drugs kept him going all night long, and it certainly created the backstage culture that we know as rock and roll.
When you tell people you're in the rock and roll business, that's an excuse for any type of behavior on earth. Who else made millions of dollars a month, worked like 6 gigs a month, and had all the drugs and freedom they wanted, and had the license from society to behave any way they wanted to?
He went to the Rainbow back in the late 60s, early 70s. You know, you could see Led Zeppelin there, and they might be doing lines on the table, and they might be getting under the table.
Did you go to Bangkok?
Yeah, I've been there before.
And did you?
It's fairly obvious who did what. We know Keith Richards became a prodigious junkie. We know that Lou Reed sang songs about speed and heroin that were anthemic.
You like singing about drugs. Is this because you like taking drugs yourself?
Oh, no, because I don't take them.
No drugs at all?
Mm-mm.
And yet you sing about them.
I'm high on life.
You want people to take drugs themselves. Is this perhaps why you sing about drugs?
Oh, yeah, I want them to take drugs.
When I took dope, I wasn't trying to expand my mind. I was just a drug addict. You know, there's no mind expansion going on. It's just out-and-out drug addict.
People got addicted, and the culture really transformed in very scary ways. So there was a sense in which the bill is coming due now, and it seemed a high price to pay for wisdom.
You know, Keith, there's in England kind of an underground top 10 about people that are expected to die soon.
I'm on this.
Hey, you're taking the #1 position in that.
Great, okay, I'll let you know.
Lou Reed is on the 2nd place. He's very proud of it.
I think he can beat me, actually.
By the time Hunter Thompson writes his famous book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, 1971, it's all changing.
The American dream really is.
A lot of the drugs became really about numbing. They became anesthesia.
Why do you take Quaaludes?
Because for the reason that anybody takes drugs, or any kind of downer.
What's that?
Which is just to escape, I guess.
We had come out of an era of severe racial strife, which involved the burning down of cities. We were in the midst of a terrible, controversial war that was ripping the country to pieces.
I think that one of the significant points about the Vietnam War and drugs is that there were two fronts in that war. There was drug use on the home front, but there was a lot of drug use in Vietnam itself.
Drugs were a gift to a lot of these soldiers that were knee-deep in horror every day and saw the most repugnant things you could possibly imagine.
Get really stoned. Then, you know, like who cares about the war?
You think that we were using drugs on the home front. What was going on in Vietnam was the U.S. military was using even harder drugs. They were shooting up heroin.
It's the only way you can feel good in Nam, you know?
How available is it? In Nam? I used to buy off the kid who was 8 or 9 years old.
8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old.
Initially, it wasn't that easy to find heroin in Vietnam, but because of the CIA and their alliances with various warlords, suddenly South Vietnam was flooded with very pure, very cheap heroin.
I was over in Vietnam a number of times with DEA, saw stuff that was unbelievable.
And this is one of the places GIs buy drugs. Sometimes they stay inside until after they've had their fix. Other addicts wait outside, and a girl comes out, passes them the heroin, and makes the sale. It's all done in broad daylight.
I saw soldiers using drugs constantly. It was certainly accepted in the culture over there. I'm not sure I blamed them. I might have done the same thing.
In the spring of 1970, you had 2 people overdosing a month. By that fall, there were 2 people overdosing a day. 1 in 4 servicemen became addicted to heroin.
He came back a war hero, wounded twice, Purple Heart, but also a drug addict. He was a drug addict.
Well, 2 things are happening. Number one, we're hearing about the soldiers becoming addicts, but we're also beginning to get flooded with heroin coming back from Vietnam. And one of the early cases I worked on was a group of sergeant majors in Vietnam who were shipping heroin back in body bags.
There might have been soldiers bringing it back for their own use and maybe in small amounts to do business. But really, the heroin being smuggled famously back in body bags was being smuggled by the CIA. It was really to support the warlords of Thailand, who were our allies. It was to secure their favor.
Many people would maintain that Air America, the CIA's operation in Southeast Asia, was responsible for a lot of the heroin that came in.
The result was blowback. You know, more drugs on the streets of American cities.
I saw my former classmates returning from Vietnam. Many of them came home with drug addiction problems. That was when I really became aware that there was a drug issue.
When I was in prison, many of my fellow prisoners were ex-Vietnam veterans who acquired huge heroin habits over there and came back and found that they couldn't maintain their habits in America. And so they reverted to what they knew best, which was weapons and tactics. So they'd rob banks.
It was becoming obvious that there was a direct correlation between street crime and heroin addiction. And this got Nixon's attention very quickly.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs. This nation faces a major crisis in terms of the increasing use of drugs, particularly among our young people.
The war on drugs was declared in 1972 by Richard Nixon. And I think part of that declaration had to do with the creation of the DEA.
We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee.
That has metastasized into a law enforcement bureaucracy that is breathtaking in its scope.
I want to tell you about an important government effort to crack down on dope pushers, an attack in which you may be able to help in wiping out the evils of drug abuse.
The DEA was formally constituted in 1973.
And I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee.
What really Nixon wanted was to turn back the tide of mass popular drug use. But turning back the tide was a gargantuan task because the cat was out of the bag.
You can't very well tell kids not to take drugs when their parents are, taking diet pills in the morning and drinking and smoking cigarettes and everything. It just has no meaning. At the moment, we're into taking chemicals.
What was happening in the larger American culture was more marijuana available in this country than at any time before, and it was coming in from everywhere.
Marijuana in the 70s started to come in tons instead of pounds, and we started to see boatloads, literally boatloads of it coming in.
Don't touch my bags if you please, Mr. Customs Man. Yeah.
I guess pot dealing started with pot smokers. It initially was an attempt to get the stuff they were smoking back home to the people they were smoking with. The smoker goes out and buys an ounce and starts selling off smaller amounts, and he's getting his free. And then they start flying to Colombia with DC-3s and bringing it back.
The drug trade just grew exponentially. In the 60s, it was these sort of lone hippie entrepreneurs, and the drug culture looked at these guys as serving a common good.
We were known as the so-called hippie mafia. The idea was to bring good product to people because we believed that marijuana had an ameliorating effect on society.
They weren't your classic criminals. They weren't your classic hippies either. They were guys who were on the edge, who were adventurers, guys who, if they weren't trafficking marijuana, would be doing other adventurous things. But hell, trafficking marijuana was adventurous, plus it made you a rich person.
At today's New York street prices, first-quality marijuana like this from Colombia is worth $92 million for the 57.5 tons.
The drug business is first and foremost a business, and we shouldn't forget that. These are guys that, had they stayed in college, would have gone to business school. Alan Long, he's a perfect example of how one works his way into the marijuana business. Alan, of course, started out as a documentary filmmaker, and he had met a dealer in New York who impressed him with tales of smuggling antics on the Mexican border. He thought it was really exciting and interesting. So he went off to make this movie about pot smuggling in Mexico, ran out of money, and decided that the best way to finance the making of the movie was to smuggle pot himself.
I never finished the movie, but my obsession switched from making the movie to finally successfully completing a marijuana smuggling deal. And it was just one incredible boondoggle after another. Finally, we hit on the right equation, and we did 13 straight airplanes.
The rest is history. Alan, in the course of the next 5 or 6 years, smuggled, according to the government, over 972,000 pounds of marijuana out of Colombia.
Wherever you had major college campuses, there was always a huge market, and the mob tried to muscle in on that, but they never had the big wholesale markets that we had. I mean, the hippie mafia controlled that.
What changed most dramatically was not the number of people who were smoking pot, it was the quality of the product. And it's what sent the smugglers down to Colombia. They went to get better pot.
I I had met someone who brought back on one of his trips to Colombia a suitcase full of gold marijuana. I smoked that pot, and everybody who smoked it with me said, "That's the best pot I've ever smoked." And for me, it was the beginning of my own version of the treasure of the Sierra Madre. I decided to go to Colombia and find the source of this gold. And my friend Vinny said, "Well, I'm coming with you."
Everybody's acting lazy, falling out.
But I didn't know anything. So I proceeded, and the only way I knew how, I got in a taxi. The guy said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I want to go to the house of a man who has 25,000 pounds of gold marijuana, a 5,000-foot runway, and 1,000 gallons of 110-octane flight fuel." The cab driver, and Vinny looked at me like, "You are crazy, they're going to kill you." And the cab driver turned around and says, "I am the man." Like this, right? And I went, "You know, I don't think you're the man, but you might know the man." We drove about 100 kilometers out into the jungle, Dodge City. Every man carries a sidearm. And we got to a tiny Indian village, and a pickup truck pulled up with an older gentleman who was decked out wearing iguana boots. He said, "I'm going to show you what you want. But if you're a drug agent, I'm going to kill you after I show you." We walk about maybe 100 yards into the brush, and there's about 50,000 pounds of gold marijuana, and a train of mules coming down from the mountains with more marijuana. Vinny looked at me and says, "This is the man. You found the man." And that's how it all started.
So now it's smuggling rings, it's operations, it's guys flying these big DC-3s, sucking on a reefer, you know, low below the radar. It's pot on a scale that the guys who brought it in the 60s could never even have dreamed about.
Here it is. Wow. A lot of weed, man.
And nothing romanticized smuggling and dealing more than the drug culture journalism of High Times.
Legalize it. Don't criticize it.
High Times was started in 1974. It was really the brainchild of a guy named Tom Forcade.
Tom Forcade was the founder and editor of High Times magazine. He is famous for the quote, "There are only two kinds of drug dealers, those who need forklifts and those who don't." And he was one of the former.
Actually, one of the reasons that High Times magazine was started was because we had a load of Colombian gold pot in New York City, and nobody knew what it was. It was a brand new product that we had to introduce to the marketplace. We came up with this idea to start a magazine.
Some of them call it ganja.
We wanted to do for marijuana what Playboy was doing for sex, basically.
Don't criticize.
So we had the centerfolds, all of these different types of cannabis substances that you had.
Legalize it, yeah, yeah, and I will advertise it.
It was the most unusual publication of its day, with a receptionist who needed a backup in case she was too stoned to answer the phone. They'd be doing pot in one room, coke in the next, nitrous oxide in the next room, and so on down the hall. They did interviews with drug-taking celebrities, and they assigned serious writers stories about drugs.
I have not read many issues of High Times as an adult, but I have read it, and I thought the articles were very well put together by people who can use their minds very well. They probably write really slowly.
It was one of the fastest growing magazines of its time. Not hard to understand. You know, 30 million people smoking pot with ever deeper pockets. It was really the golden age of marijuana.
If you just look throughout the country, marijuana is pervasive. It's all over, at every social level throughout the country.
One toke over the line, sweet Jesus, one toke over the line. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line.
In the 70s, pot became mass merchandising. It was in the workplace, in high schools, in mass media. And you have this generation, you know, kids who had money, time, nowhere to go except the mall, and a lot of drugs on hand.
When I don't have it, I smoke between 10 and 15 a week, not including Friday nights and Saturday nights. And then when I got it, I smoke twice that much.
You smoke 30 joints a week if you have a bag of your own?
If I got a bag of my own, it's usually gone in 2 hours.
In every school around America, there is the stoner culture. There is the group of people who are the stoners. You could always pick them out of a crowd because they would be the ones wearing the flannel shirts, the concert t-shirt underneath, the long hair, then the baggy jeans that had holes in them.
Checking out the halls, making sure the coast is clear. Looking in the stalls, no, there ain't nobody here.
There's a lot of cliches around pot use and the stupid stoner image. You get high, you get dumb, you forget things, and you want to eat.
I guess every day I get high.
What do you do?
Mostly pot.
Where do you do it at school?
The bathrooms, stairwells.
Are you high? My who?
Pot was just like eating cereal, wasn't it? It's like no big deal at all.
How many joints I was smoking was about 100 a week.
During the 70s, it became like kind of, this is a way to be, just like you would be maybe 30 years before, you'd be kind of a teen at the malt shop. Now you were sort of a stoner at the 7-Eleven.
You're on camera!
Well, I'm a child of the 70s, and it is hard to imagine anyone growing up in that era who did not get stoned, eat tremendous amounts of ice cream, and listen to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
I went through a big period listening to a lot of Pink Floyd, and not just listening, but kind of like crawling inside of it, you know, and standing inside of it and watching, you know. It was, for me as a musician, I started to see music.
Laserium, where it's live laser light shows.
Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
Taking away the moments that make up a dull day.
In the 70s, the stoners had their own culture. They could go to a Pink Floyd light show and blow their minds. And then they had Cheech and Chong, their own comedians.
Hijo de la chingada. Is that a joint, man? But I've been in the right place, but it must have been the wrong time. I'd have said the right thing, but it seemed like a wrong.
Well, Cheech and I started, we did all sorts of like sex jokes. Put a few pot jokes in there, but not many. But then we did a concert in front of some rock and rollers. And the only thing they really identified with was the pot humor, because that's what everybody was doing. And then Cheech and I became the pot comedians.
Talk it out, man.
You're smoking weed, you're watching them smoke weed, they smoke more weed.
Kind of grabbed you by the boo-boo, don't it?
God, the IQ level's really going down.
I've got to ask you about the drugs because I know both of you experimented very heavily in your younger days.
Yeah. Well, we got the experiments down now, so we know what we're doing.
Cheech and Chong created these two great characters. I mean, they were really live-action cartoons, I thought, and parodies of pot smokers and parodies of hippies. It was a wonderful comic conceit that they created.
Hey, what's your name, man? The dude wants to know your name, man. His name is Ralph, man.
Cheech and Chong were hilarious. They hit us perfectly when we were 14, 15 years old. And it was part of the normalizing of the drug experience. You know, now we had not just our own music, but our own comedians, our own TV shows, our own everything.
It wasn't until Cheech and Chong and George Carlin came out that they could actually, you know, imitate people smoking marijuana.
And there was also Richard Pryor talking as a witness, you know, from the first person, hysterically, with a great insight.
See that boy over there, Rich? Now that boy's a junkie.
Pryor did characters from his life.
What's happening?
that were so full of emotion and so simultaneously harrowingly hysterical that there's really been no one like him as well.
My father said he don't want to see me in the vicinity. You know, just because I stole his television.
I don't think you can talk about drug humor without talking about Saturday Night Live.
Live from New York, it's Saturday Night!
And it became very revolutionary in the 70s when Saturday Night Live started.
Saturday Night Live, the classic lineup. Chevy Chase, Bill Murray, Gilda Radner, John Belushi, of course, and there were some more overt drug references.
The people involved in Saturday Night Live were very aware that they were making entertainment for an audience that was going to be stoned out of their tree. And that also meant comedy about drugs.
Why do you think they call it dope?
And you find out later on that a lot of people in that building were doing like small mountains of cocaine.
Achoo.
The reason it was so successful is because millions of people got it. The vast youth of America was doing these things and laughing at these things. But here came a network television show that addressed all these issues.
Mama off the tree, man.
Saturday Night Live, they really broke such ground. You know, it's late night, so they really used that to be as outspoken as they possibly could. It's really almost like a microcosm of art and drug use, in, you know, over the span of almost of 3 centuries. Of 3 centuries. Good night. 3 decades. We'll be right back with I'm Really Sober.
I'd say there was as much dope in the music business as there is in virtually any other business now. There's no sort of underground movement of people taking dope, you know? The most extraordinary straight people are taking dope, including cocaine.
There was a time in this country when having a cocaine habit was about as easy to come by as an interest-bearing account in Zurich. You had to have a lot of money to have a cocaine habit. Having cocaine was like flying to Paris for breakfast. It was an extravagance associated with people whose lives were extravagant.
That's about $2,000 an ounce.
Really? And what is the kick of it? Because I never...
For one thing, it was identified, you know, with the elite of the entertainment culture.
When I made films then, the hairdresser would always have the cocaine, and it was like a great picker-upper. A little coke at 3:30 in the afternoon, you know, and I had it under control. Other people were totally out of control.
Back in the 70s in Los Angeles, I would go into a party. It would feel like outtakes from Scarface. Wait a minute. You got to be kidding me. No. Next to the pretzel nuggets, cashews, and then a bowl of blow. Whoa, my God. Everyone was out of their mind.
There was this kind of era of good feelings. The end of the threat of being drafted made for a kind of crazy time. And disco and cocaine, to me, seem to go together perfectly.
It is the ultimate ego drug. That first line of cocaine made you feel like God for about 15 or 20 minutes.
Oh, you're not shaved? There's no way in a million years we're gonna get in. It doesn't matter if you're not shaved. Listen, just go home.
Disco and Coke were a beautiful synthesis because Coke allowed you to stay up all night, dance all night, have energy all night, and have tremendous libidinal satisfaction at the end of the night, which were all the things that disco promised.
Cocaine was very me decade. You know, there was that sense of, this isn't about us, this is about me, and maybe a little bit about you tonight.
I went to Studio 54, erotic Studio 54. The whole mixture of male, female, transsexual, gorgeous, gorgeous girls and boys. And, of course, you know, cocaine on the balcony all night long.
Movie stars, fashion divas, great athletes, jet setters, politicians, you name it, they were there. To me, it always looked like something right out of pagan Rome. People would be blown away on cocaine. You know, sex going on everywhere, behind the drapes, in the balcony, in the unisexual bathrooms. Everyone just stoned out of their skulls.
It's difficult to know what it is exactly that attracts people here. All that one can be absolutely sure of is that it isn't the conversation.
Not everyone could afford cocaine, and that was the thing about it in the beginning, but the demographics of the drug culture really changed in the 70s.
If you want to look at the metastasis of the cocaine industry in the United States, one of the more successful ways to do that is to look at it from a business point of view. The people that were loading up those DC-3s on the runways in Colombia with marijuana were ultimately put out of business by U.S. drug interdiction efforts in the Caribbean. Marijuana was a very difficult commodity to move because in order to make any money, you had to move bulk shipments. And when the Caribbean closed down, some of the drug entrepreneurs decided that they could do better with cocaine than they could with marijuana. And for the first time in however long cocaine had been around, 1,000 years, they had a market for it in the United States.
A gram of cocaine, $80 to $100, that became a little more affordable. It was something better than the common man's marijuana. But now, you could do it.
Nighttime, the west side of Manhattan, New York. Using a hidden camera and a special night lens, we filmed 20 coke deals in 2 hours on a rainy Wednesday night.
Coke just became astoundingly prevalent and available at all levels of society.
If you take one even blow of good coke, whether it costs you a lot of money or not, you are going to get stoned.
Coke is becoming, in the words of the DEA, the recreational drug of choice among people from all social and economic groups.
It was businessmen, teachers, journalists, attorneys.
I remember in the 70s, the word on the street was that cocaine wasn't addictive.
Cocaine is not addictive, but it is enticing.
Time magazine was saying it, let alone High Times magazine.
High Times magazine went on a whole 2 or 3 year cocaine binge when they had cocaine centerfolds in the magazine.
I think it was Science magazine that wrote a paragraph that I have that said intranasal use of cocaine was probably no more addicting than eating peanut butter or potato chips.
In the 70s, I was a disco guy. Cocaine made it possible for us to stay out and dance all night and then think we were fine the next day. Of course, you're not.
In the 70s, maybe just from the explosion in a culture of all kinds of things and anything goes, I remember, I'm trying to remember, a period when I don't know if I knew anybody that didn't do drugs. You know, it was just everywhere.
In a Marin County town called Mill Valley, there's a shop called the Pleasure Principle. It's what is known as a head shop. David McDonald, the shop owner, told us about his merchandise.
It's a scale that will weigh out accurately the more precious commodities, generally of a powderous nature. This particular thing here is a unique stash bottle, which could contain everything from illicit substance down to vanilla snow dust.
By the end of the 70s, getting high was an end unto itself. And it wasn't just rock stars, it was across the board.
Whiskey bottles and brand new cars. Oak tree, you're in my way. There's too much coke and too much smoke.
The paraphernalia industry had become huge by that time. Rolling papers were available at your neighborhood 7-Eleven store.
We have cherry and mint and strawberry and banana.
There were millions of kids reading High Times magazine. Headshots in every community across the United States.
This is an Acapulco gold candle. It simulates a kilo of marijuana. It is a very, very fast-moving item.
This was real American mainstream consumerism.
So take another toke, have a blow for your nose. One more drink, fool, we're trying you.
The most disturbing thing is that the paraphernalia is a teaching tool to children. For instance, the Frisbee pot pipe. They're items designed for kids. You put a little pot in here and then reassemble this, and this is the pipe part. So you have a toke, and then you toss a toke to a friend across the field or the schoolyard.
Pot was normalized in a way that it never had been before.
If I was president, I'd have done had it legalized a long time ago.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
During the Carter administration, President Carter embraced the concept of legalizing for personal use marijuana. And there were groups that were working to make drug use less of a crime and more socially acceptable.
Please smoke pot! Please smoke pot!
We were at the peak of a drug epidemic in this country.
I don't really have to go out and find it. It's just somebody comes up and say, hey, you want to smoke one? It finds you, more or less.
I think parents woke up one day and realized that we had a serious drug problem in the country, that their children were being subjected to drugs. Frequently, parents recognize there's a problem, but they don't think it's with their child. And some parents started to realize, oh yes, it is my child.
There were a lot of parents in this country who were aghast. I was like, what's this?
I didn't believe it at first.
Yes. When I found a bong.
What is a bong?
See?
The kids
You know what a bong is?
When I found one in her room, I thought she was blowing bubbles. I had no idea. I mean,
Yeah, my parents weren't very drug savvy at all, I would have to say. My brother actually grew pot plants for a while up in his room, and when we were caught smoking it, they were just mortified. Like, how could you?
Tom, how could you? Mother.
What a betrayal. And I'm like, well, it's up there, you know.
My parents actually thought you rolled the joint and stuck it in your arm, like Chevy Chase did on Saturday Night Live, and I'm not kidding. My mother said, I can't believe you stick that stuff in your arm. And she was visiting me in jail.
I don't know what parents can do, because I've tried everything. I know, I've asked, I've read, I've studied, I've prayed. I'm still looking for an answer. I'm not going to give up hope, because I am that fearful of it.
These parents started calling up the schools and the state drug hotlines. And what they heard was, oh, it's no big deal. It's normalized. We know that there's a certain amount of pot smoking that goes on. It's just a phase they're going through. They were freaked out.
You drive around school and you see the boys across the street smoking. What are they smoking? Cigarettes or pot? You don't know. There's a lot more that are doing it than we want to admit to. And any way we can deter it, I'm ready for it.
And so the parents started talking to each other. We had a number of parents in the country that kind of took the leadership on it and said, I'm mad. I'm going to do something about this.
You have to become involved with your children. You have to become knowledgeable of what marijuana does to children in order to be effective.
This parents' movement began in the bicentennial summer of 1976, and within a couple of years, there were 4,000 chapters of it, and they were dead serious.
We had parents who became totally outraged over paraphernalia shops opening everywhere in neighborhoods, and they began to go to lawmakers and show lawmakers, you know, this is a bong. This is what kids use to smoke pot with. It's being sold down the street from where we live. We want that shop out of here. Parents became grassroots advocates about drug policy in this country.
The drug warriors found a natural ally in the presidential candidate of the Republican Party in 1980, Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, had been fighting this battle against these dope-smoking hippies since he was governor of California in the late 1980s.
State and local officials.
The national dialogue on drugs was now being controlled by people whose agenda was to portray them in the most dire apocalyptic terms possible.
There was a definite shift in consciousness that took place about drugs in the 80s. You know, enough of this kind of 60s mollycoddling. Let's clamp down.
Previously, Almost Perfect Strangers and the Bogey Bunch at Van as Chitara battle it out with the Velvet Rope Revolution.
In the original Star Wars trilogy, what actor provides the voice of the villainous Darth Vader?
Then Peanut Butter and Janelli face off against El Chupacabra. The heat is on. From VH1 and Entertainment Weekly, it's the World Series of Pop Culture presented by Alltel Wireless. Catch an all-new episode at its new regular time tomorrow at 10. Go to VH1.com and hit V-Spot for more on your favorite teams.
See this cute little vial here? It's crack, rock cocaine, the most addictive form. You think it's the glamour drug of the 80s? Well, that's the point of this fronted little reminder. It can kill you. And if you've got to die for something, this sure as hell ain't it.
We must mobilize all our forces to stop the flow of drugs into this country.
We're under an invasion.
In the 80s and 90s, it was hard to even think about something like drug culture, except in almost criminal terms.
Say hello to my little friend!
What should you do when someone offers you drugs?
A couple of friends and I would get an 8-ball and we'd go through it, and then we'd go get another one, you know, the next day because we still didn't feel like sleeping. I would stay up for 4 or 5 days at a time.
Cocaine definitely shifted the American public's attitudes about the harms of drugs. Clearly, we saw people die from the drugs.
Lynn Bias is dead at 22.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it. And didn't inhale, and never tried it again.
Now, who doesn't want to take ecstasy?
That's some good. The lights started happening. Then when it was time to have sex, it was a wrap.
The drugs, they come and go. You know, we look at this as a 40-year period, but we're not really at the end of anything. I think that the genie is out of the bottle and drugs will always be with us.
Cocaine is not just the drug of Hollywood or New York anymore. It's all over America, even in small towns. It is also estimated that 22 million Americans now have tried cocaine.
In the early 80s, cocaine just took over the drug world. Marijuana became a nothing drug. LSD was gone by 80, so it became cocaine as the drug of choice.
Cocaine has reached Driggs, Idaho, and every other place in America, and no one has yet found a way to stop it.
You know, your desire for the feeling that you have inside your body would get so strong that, you know, you'd have to have more.
Pure energy. According to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, every day 5,000 more Americans are trying cocaine for the first time.
It became about sensation. It became about self. It became about more. It became about party. It became about money. It became about flash. It became about me, me, me.
I love the 80s.
I personally knew of stockbrokers and lawyers who would spend millions of dollars on cocaine in a year.
Cocaine was a very glamorous drug. At that time, it was still fun, and it was disco, and it was rock and roll, and it was flashy, and it was eccentric, and it was loud, and it was glam, you know, and I can't believe I still have a nose.
There was a moment in the culture when the cocaine phenomenon turned toxic. Around 1983. You have a series of events that poisons the atmosphere for drug use in this country. You have Richard Pryor on Freebase setting himself on fire and going screaming down the streets of the San Fernando Valley.
Pryor told the doctor at the burn ward at the hospital last night that he had used Freebase, which is a combination of cocaine and ether. And when he ignited it, whether it was on a cigarette, we don't know, the ether exploded, causing his clothes to be engulfed in flames.
You have the death of John Belushi, which is even more significant.
The line became too foggy, you know, and when you're in a cocaine speedball haze, of course, who could find the line?
Particularly after John died, a lot of celebrities looked at themselves and cut back.
When 20 million Americans were doing cocaine and it was starting to get toxic, it was only a matter of time before people in the drug culture started addressing it.
Bass.
One of the first statements was made by the hip-hop community in the song White Lines.
Vision, dreams of passion going through our mind. And all the while I think of you.
The thing about Melly Mel was that he was talking some real in his songs, you know?
The more I see, the more I do.
A lot of people took it like a party song, but he was mainly trying to educate people like this out there that's killing your brains.
They painted such a vivid picture of what it is, what it does. It's intoxicating and addictive.
My white lines go a long way, either up your nose or through your vein, with nothing to gain except killing your brain. Freeze!
Well, legend has it, and I definitely know that to be a fact because he verified it, was that as Melly Mel was making white lines, he was doing lines as he was doing his lyrics.
Baby, get higher, baby, get higher, baby, and don't ever come down. Free, baby.
That's hip hop for you. Hip hop is contradictory, you know. Don't do it, do it.
Don't do it.
And then at the same time that you have these episodes happening in the popular culture, you have the onset of the Reagan administration's war on drugs.
We're taking down the surrender flag that has flown over so many drug efforts. We're running up a battle flag.
I think the Reagans were probably the most effective administration we've had in dealing with the drug problem.
That was the next stage in the culture wars. Drugs in the 80s became a tool of the right, not a tool of the left. It became a bludgeon by which to kind of say, what are these people talking about? You know, they're criminals, they're drug addicts. Let's put them in jail.
Please! And then simultaneous to this, you have the organization of the Medellin cartel, and you have violence in Miami.
Well, Miami was always the Latin American point of entry. It was South America on this side of the water.
Sweet dreams are made of these. Who am I to disagree?
It became really a financial center of the drug industry in the United States. There came a time when the people in Miami were the Colombians. Prior to that, however, Miami was controlled by Cubans.
Sweet dreams are made of these.
The cocaine cowboys, who were really the Cuban middlemen. These were the guys who were like really starting to market cocaine down there in significant quantities. There were vast amounts of money. It bred a culture of excess, of flash and extravagance, but it also bred a culture of violence. And the initial idea of doing Scarface was to take the original Howard Hawks film and transpose it to that situation in Miami.
Move it back inside. Come on, move!
DEA agents and money launderers and corrupt cops.
Against the wall right now. Down. On the ground. On the ground, man.
People beginning to smuggle the drug in on speedboat and mules, and people swallowing balloons of cocaine. It was just extraordinary. And they gave Oliver Stone the job of writing the screenplay. And it was a perfect vehicle for him because he was deep into his own cocaine use, and he started banging out this tale of Tony Montana.
Scarface was clearly an exaggeration, but it was in the right ballpark. That's how crazy it was. That's exactly how crazy it was in those days.
If there's one moment that becomes a metaphor for the whole American experience of cocaine, it comes at the end when Tony Montana is being surrounded by his enemies, and he goes face down in a giant mound of cocaine. Like,
a lot of people remember that scene where he's got a mound of cocaine on him, and he does that famous snort.
That's where you go, wow, that's a whole lot of drugs going on there. It's just like, yo.
And he comes up, and it's like on his face. It's like that is what happened to America.
Cocaine was a flashy drug. And to be able to say you do coke meant you had money and it was fly. When it turned into freebase, it became very cool for a while too.
What freebase is they take the powder and they reduce it through a chemical process down to its base, once again, so that you can smoke it. It's extremely potent and instantaneous in its effect.
Freebase was something that was even that much more expensive than cocaine, and it was something that you had to buy a lot of cocaine to manufacture. It was being used by people who had a lot of money and people in the glamour professions. Crack became the street person's equivalent of that drug.
I make $10. I head right to the crack man and get crack.
Crack was smokable cocaine that was reduced back to its smokable base with baking soda. Any 12-year-old could cook some up on his oven and sell it on the street corner.
Crack is the budget way of getting high.
Look, at first, this wasn't a poor man's high. At first, it was a rich man's high. Now it got to a level where now the minorities even involved in it.
Crack came about as a result of a market glut of cocaine.
Before the advent of crack, the least amount of money you could spend to buy cocaine in New York was $80 to $100. We had an informant. He was involved with the first organization that started making crack. They made a knowing business decision to make it cheaper. Crack started selling at $10 a vial. I mean, in the end, it was selling at $3 a vial.
Crack, crack, crack. Everywhere you go, crack. You don't hear no dope, Harley. You don't hear no coke anymore, Harley. The only thing you hear is people saying, jumbo, crack. Jumbo, crack.
The key year for crack was 1985, after Reagan started his second term, and all kinds of urban development was severely cut back. And these entrepreneurial drug industries are growing up right around the same time that economic opportunity was taken from these communities.
Thinking of a master plan. This ain't nothing but sweat inside my hands. So I dig into my pocket, all my money spent. So I get deeper, but still coming up with lengths.
Drugs were the #1 employer of ghetto youth. The cool thing about selling drugs, you don't need application. You don't need insurance, Social Security. I mean, there's no dress code. You're your own boss. You're self-employed. You set your own hours. And there's a demand.
Cause I'm paid full.
Cocaine brought more money into the inner cities than any other drug or hustle. I mean, I've been in count houses where the crack houses were. I'm talking about money up to your knees.
The problem is turf. And now turf wars. And now gangs. Now they had money to buy guns.
Brothers and sisters, I don't know what this world is coming to.
People are armed, people are dangerous, and people are acting irrationally.
All of a sudden, the violence level grew so huge. We saw kids shooting at kids. It became intolerable.
It would be a shame to turn the city into an orange camp, but we are going to be very close to it.
People were terrified. You know, it seemed like an apocalypse.
Something should be done to stop it, even if it requires the imposition of martial law.
Okay, you slow down.
I think the biggest cultural change that cocaine had on the United States was that it femalized drug addiction. Why was it such a huge issue? Because the traditional inner city family was matriarchal. And traditionally, those mothers were not drug addicts. Cocaine changed the face of that, where mothers and women became drug addicts in the inner city, which concomitantly gave rise to juvenile crime because nobody was running the family, and that, I think, changed the face of every major city in the United States.
Hands up against the wall. Who's using crack? Any of you ladies? No. Huh? No.
Crack really had a huge and terrifying impact on America. Like very quick, like within a year, there's a crack epidemic in America. Like wham!
And once the word got out that crack was really killing the community, rap as a whole decided, you know what? We got to stop crack.
Here it is, bam! And you say, damn, this is a dope jam. But let's define the term called dope, and you're thinking me funky now. No.
Public Enemy were doing the same conscious rap as Melly Mel and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 and all those guys were. Only it was, you know, a more modern approach to what hip-hop had turned into.
Talk about
Public Enemy made music that actually went along with the energy of crack.
We tried to show some of the downsides of crack. Well, that's what Night of the Living Bassheads did when we made it.
Yeah, boy! Yo, bust the move!
In today's edition of PETV News, we'll explore the devastating effects drugs are having on our society in what is now termed the Basshead Syndrome.
Night of the Living Bassheads is one of the greatest hip-hop videos of all time.
In the never-ending search for the Bassheads, we've come to a new hiding place. Yeah, that's right, Wall Street.
The part that I played was this roving reporter for PETV, and I bust into a corporate room where all of these executives were doing cocaine.
Like, I was brainwashed. Like, what do white people have to do with the drug dilemma?
The fact of the matter is that all the years that crack was making headlines, 75% of the cocaine users in the United States were white.
The crack business was a very deadly business. And because it was concentrated in black neighborhoods, it appeared a certain way in the press. And the press often had a field day with it in very racist terms, I think.
Crack is cropping up in big city ghettos like
and many of those users are poor and black or Hispanic.
3 black men came up in a van and opened fire with a shotgun and semi-automatic handgun.
The press had a wonderful time with it. While cursing the phenomenon, they celebrated.
A cheap coke that can kill.
Cheaper and more destructive form of cocaine.
The newest deadly narcotic.
America's latest and most vicious drug.
Crack is so potent and pure, overdose is easy.
There was a quality of hysteria in the reporting of crack.
The drug situation in New York is totally out of control.
We have seen drugs start before and spread across the country. Nothing with the speed that we have seen with crack.
Crack, there was a lot about it we didn't know. We said things that weren't true.
Drug-addicted babies
were abandoned by mothers hooked on crack.
Up to 100,000 born addicted every year.
The whole crack baby issue, turned out, I guess, scientifically to be not nearly as bad or as true as people say. But at the time, people believed it was true.
These children are the innocent victims of the dreadful drug epidemic.
It was big ratings. Crack was one of the biggest stories in the American news media since Watergate and since the Vietnam War. It becomes a watershed because it also dovetails with the escalation of the war on drugs.
Drugs are menacing our society.
We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use.
I will announce tomorrow a series of new proposals for a drug-free America.
The Drug-Free America Act of 1986 was really all about crack. It was like the Congress was falling all over itself to get tough on drugs, and crack became the perfect excuse.
It was a very productive time. When we've had tough laws and we've enforced our laws, we've made much better progress in dealing with drugs in the country.
Here's how it broke down. 5 grams of crack worth $125 on the street would automatically trigger a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years, no matter that it would take 500 grams of cocaine powder worth $50,000 to trigger the same sentence.
Crack and cocaine are the same thing, but when you buy it as crack, you're buying a small amount. They incarcerated people who bought less drugs for longer times. There was an inconsistency in that law.
The results of that have been to fill our prisons with a lot of inner-city black and Latino youth. Those guys are not the guys who are importing the drugs.
The people that are in prison for drug offenses belong there. They rarely do. There are people peddling drugs to our kids, and I don't have any sympathy for people who peddle poison to children.
If Mr. Sontag is finished with these defendants, you may take them away.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
I was raised as a child in that Reagan era. It was drugs are going to kill you, drugs are no good. But the biggest campaign I remember is to say no to drugs. That phrase stuck with me.
I pledge to say no. I pledge to say no. To drugs and alcohol. To drugs and alcohol.
Just say no.
Just Say No campaign really bugged me because I was right at the age that they were just saying no to.
Have any of you children ever experimented with drugs? Yes.
Well, aren't some drugs okay? Like, I heard pot won't hurt you.
All drugs are dumb.
Different Strokes was a show that I loved, and you felt at that moment that she was more down to earth because she was in that realm of a cool TV show.
If you just say no, you'll be saying yes to a whole lot more.
And that whole campaign was built around the movement at that time to show children that drugs are harmful and to show parents that their children are at risk.
I did an organization which was an offshoot of Just Say No, which was called Hollywood Kids Say No to Drugs. I remember a very prophetic moment. We were up at this thing called Country Fest. It was in front of 40,000 people, and I'm presenting the mayor with this jacket, Just Say No to Drugs. And sure enough, like as soon as we were done with the event, we went back to the car, smoked some weed, and went on some rides at the fair.
While you can understand people's fear about what drugs have done and continue to do, it's such a kind of narrow solution. It was a question of just saying no. Well, that doesn't really work. Nobody's just saying no.
It's very important for people to realize that there are no barriers in the drug culture. Everybody is susceptible.
We have a very comprehensive education program in our school system, from pre-kindergarten to the 12th grade, trying to teach young people about the scourges and dangers of drugs.
I'm from Washington, D.C., and I remember our mayor got put in jail for smoking crack.
The arrest of Marion Barry was a cultural watershed. The idea that the mayor of a major U.S. city, the seat of our government, was arrested in a hotel room using crack was something that people looked at and just thought, where have we arrived here?
I want to call my lawyer right now. I mean, then I got for being with this damn bitch setting me up like this. Set me up, ain't that a bitch? Calm down.
Marion Barry getting caught doing crack was the telltale sign that that is a disease.
For the first 10 years, it was great, it was magical. And somewhere along the line, I crossed the line, and it became horrible. And I became alone in a room with a bottle and drugs, you know? Who wants that?
Suddenly, you had people in trouble with drugs on a scale that had never really happened before in this country.
I remember when I was doing it and I would find blow in my house. Oh, I never knew. It was like literally thinking Santa Claus came down. That's when you know you have a problem. When you're just doing like Tevye dances, finding blow, you know.
20 million people tried cocaine, all different levels of use and abuse, obviously. 5 million of those 20 million became daily users of the drug. That's a lot of people using cocaine every day.
I stole it from my family. I stole it from my son.
It was just an obsession. I was obsessed with that feeling.
Suddenly it became obvious that these people needed a place to go, where they could not have access to the substances, where they would have to be educated about what had happened to them. From the mid-'80s until the early '90s, you had an enormous growth in this new drug rehab industry. But it was keyed by the fact that there was a whole generation of rock stars, of celebrities, who are now visibly in trouble with drugs.
David Crosby was arrested for drug and gun possession in Dallas. The police found freebasing equipment and 1/4 gram of cocaine in Crosby's dressing room.
I would like to be free from drugs. I would like to be free from jail.
Recovery is celebrity-driven in this country.
I was going to have to stop doing drugs, or
they were dead a few times. So.
At the end of my snorting half of Peru.
Strangely involved in the use of cocaine.
I'm an addicted personality. Do I want to be a stoned musician, or do I want to live?
In the 1980s, a new tourist spot implanted itself in the American imagination, and that's the Betty Ford Quint.
One of the next chapters in the story of the drug culture became not doing drugs.
Are you off drugs completely now?
Yes, I am.
Recovery is the new drug.
It's just a way to be. This is the 90s. I get hip.
As soon as celebrities started cleaning up in public with their tell-alls and their documentaries and their VH1s and their Tears on Oprah, everyone would go, oh, okay, well, he's not hiding from us. He's being honest. Now we kind of like him more. And there became virtue in being a survivor.
And it almost became a cliche after a while.
VH1 goes behind the music.
Every VH1 special, they're all the same. Basically, we could write one now. They start and they're really good friends.
A link that formed in childhood.
They make some music in a garage and someone hears them and they sign them and they become really big.
Talked about band in Southern California.
And they sell tons of albums.
Popularity was skyrocketing.
And they go on the road and they do a world tour.
Sold out concerts everywhere.
They start taking drugs.
Played hard and partied harder.
Doing a ton of cocaine.
He'd become the poster boys for heavy metal decadence.
The drugs eventually take over their lives.
Caught on a roller coaster ride they couldn't control.
My hero
overdose had either died or were addicted. But heroin had a firm grip on his life. He had become an addict.
I mean, I was sure that John was going to die.
You know, Nikki's in the hospital. You think he's dead.
Woke up the next day. The needle was still in my arm.
When they were taking drugs, they became bitter enemies and they all hated each other.
But in '85, dope was starting to drive them apart. Their friendships had sunk to an all-time low.
Eventually, 10 years down the road, they're so debilitated by drugs that they have to go into rehab.
Checked himself into drug rehab, helped him through the agonizing withdrawal.
And then they get out of the rehabs and they put out a new album.
And the band embarked on a new chapter.
And that album always sucks.
They were together again, old friends remembering old times.
And now we're supposed to believe that they all love each other and they're putting the band back together. And it's a crock of, you know.
We are a society that does put some sort of premium on redemption. And so that's a nice narrative. And it's certainly a better story than the one of self-destruction.
How long have you been clean now?
A little over 3.5 years, I'm happy to say.
Does America like anything more than a life gone bad and a life resurrected?
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Yeah! Save the wretch like me.
But in a way, Marion Barry's arrest and trial helped him improve his political position.
I once was lost, but now I'm found. Blind, but now I see.
He got a slap on the wrist, and he got reelected.
We all need somebody to lean on.
Forgive, and you shall be forgiven. Thank you, and God bless.
The ecstasy drug, it makes you love everybody. You don't want to fight anybody. It makes you feel good.
In the 1980s, you have three things going on simultaneously that are also vastly different from each other and are yet outgrowths of the same drug culture. You have crack, you have rehab and recovery, and then you have ecstasy.
Well, guess what? We've got another drug. It is synthetic, and it makes you love everybody.
You can use MDMA to lower anxiety, decrease defensiveness and resistance to looking inward in a truly profound way.
Back in the late 70s, early 80s, psychotherapists around the country started giving MDMA to their patients with pretty impressive results, actually, especially when dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder.
I was diagnosed to have terminal cancer a few months ago, and naturally there's a lot of fear and anger and pain, emotional pain that surrounds something like that. It has allowed me to open up and have communication with my family that I have never been able to have before.
The more people that tried it, it sort of started to leak out into the community, and groups of people were taking it. And by the early mid-'80s, it was being used in bars and clubs in Dallas, Texas.
How many would you like? For now, the drug is legal. Users say its effects are euphoric.
Every song is your favorite song. Every person is your best friend.
Business is booming.
And you could buy it with a credit card, you know, on a hotline.
The drug has been around for several years, but what we've seen in the last couple of years is an escalation of the availability.
What are you concerned about? A lot of young kids bouncing around?
Precisely. The other thing is when we apprehend these people, they can be dealt with. At the present time, it's not against the law.
So you can't apprehend them now?
We cannot.
But you really want to, don't you?
I think it's important.
It's a status symbol type thing. I think that it goes over so well simply, and this sounds very strange, simply with the title, Designer Drugs.
The DEA had seen enough ecstasy that they decided that they were going to try to criminalize it.
This morning, the Drug Enforcement Administration is announcing its intention to place the drug known as MDMA, or by the street name ecstasy,
under emergency controls in Schedule 1.
Once ecstasy became illegal, then the rave scene started, which were these sort of underground, large gatherings of people who would be dancing to electronic music and taking ecstasy.
Just what is it that you want to do?
We want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. And we want to get loaded, and we want to have a good time.
Once again, you have a whole youth culture finding a new drug.
You're in like a kind of trance, and you just want to hug everybody and love everybody.
It ping-ponged back and forth from the United States to England, then back to the United States, then over to England.
It's good to hug people and, yeah, you know, and it gets you dancing because it gets your adrenaline going.
We're naturally social animals, and we crave connection. And there's something about MDMA that does make you feel connected more to other people.
Ultimately, there were a lot of different kinds of raves, but usually at some point of the night, for some amount of sustained time, everybody in the room feels the group exists more than I do. This sort of sense of disappearance is a great relief to people who are living in a me culture, who are living in a place where they're supposed to achieve as individuals and buy as individuals and watch TV as individuals. To let go of that and experience this thing is remarkable.
The rave movement was created in a way as an antidote to the emptiness of a lot of our rituals and rites of passage in our own culture.
This was something different. These kids were looking for something else other than the gross materialism of the cocaine culture.
High enjoyment level. It's top people, it's top buzz, top music, top atmosphere. No hostility, unity. Back to the 60s.
The drugs are not just something to dull your pain. The drugs are something that, once again, are supposed to, enliven consciousness.
The acid tests in the 1960s were tightly controlled environments of psychedelia. The raves of the 80s and 90s were designed with just as much sort of self-consciousness.
All of the things that we're doing with the psychedelics, now and in the 80s, we were learning from what happened in the 60s. So, for example, Burning Man, I would say, is an example in our culture now of 35,000 people getting in the desert for a week and having all sorts of artistic and celebratory experiences, some of them involving psychedelics.
Just what is it that you want to do?
Everybody's out here for the same reason. Freaks Are Us is basically the name of the game.
Mind-expanding experiences, if you know what I mean.
It's a kind of American Aboriginal experience.
We want to be free to do what we want to do.
And that's what I think Burning Man is really about. Let me take my clothes off, swallow a psychedelic, and throw myself into it. It's Woodstock.
We want to be free to do what we want to do.
It all went full circle. It's like we get caught in this continuum where it all just goes round and round and round, and the real question becomes, do we learn anything? The most obvious proof that drugs were not going anywhere was what happened with ecstasy in the 90s. Because that generation, if you remember, was the product of more anti-drug education than any generation in history. They grew up with that symbol of the egg.
This is your brain. This is drugs.
This is your brain on drugs.
This is your brain on drugs.
Did it stop them? No.
It seems that humanity has always tried to alter their consciousness through plants or herbs or liquids or concoction.
Nothing really goes away. Things just sort of like come around in loops.
Heroin was once known as the most evil of drugs. Now, among teenagers, its use is on the rise.
Well, there was like a sense in the early 90s where, heroin just kind of came back in a big way. The price that got paid for it was also really high.
County medical examiner in Seattle announced late Friday afternoon that a body found there Friday morning is, in fact, that of the 27-year-old singer and guitarist Kurt Cobain.
It's clear to me that because we are not allowed to be honest about drugs,
we made our kids believe that marijuana and heroin were the same thing, for example.
It seems that every generation is consigned to go off and make the same mistakes as the one previously did, albeit perhaps with a different drug.
Closer to 2000 and beyond, we're seeing more and more people with chronic methamphetamine abuse and all the problems that go along with that.
People can make it themselves. They can become their own little business, going on to farmers' property, stealing the ammonia. Whew, wow. It's some lifestyle, man. You can spot these people a mile away. You can sure see a meth user.
Do these people remember speed in the 1960s? Speed kills being scrawled on the walls of the Haight-Ashbury? The 60s generation had its speed epidemic. No one seems to remember it, though. We more or less operate in a state of cultural amnesia about drugs in general.
I think the culture is beginning to change again. 5 years from now, I don't think people will be talking about marijuana and cocaine. I think it'll be all the pharmaceuticals and the man-mades.
OxyContin is basically synthetic heroin in time-release capsules. Now, if you break the time-release capsules, you can get just as high as you can on heroin.
There's no question now that these prescription medicines are the new drugs of abuse for this generation.
People have been taking drugs since the beginning of time. Drugs are part of our existence on Earth as a species.
Let's face it, it is part of our culture. It is part of our society. It is part of life.
The story of drugs is really an American epic. The bebop generation, and the beats, and then the folkies, and then the psychedelic era, and then the rockers, and then the cocaine era, and then crack, and then recovery, and then ecstasy, and beyond. It's a long and really fascinating narrative.
I think there was a magical time when experimenting with drugs worked out okay.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
4 times.
1, 2, 3,
That's why it's hard to say to a kid, don't take drugs. Because, for a little while, it might work and they might actually do something interesting. But they also could die.
Everybody knows people that you just have that feeling that they're not going to be 70 years old ever, Not everybody makes it.
Why am I against drugs? Just because of all the downsides where good people get taken down. And that's why I don't like them. Man, drugs suck, man.
Americans have a lot of freedom, and unfortunately, not everybody handles the freedom in a responsible way. That's why I find drugs so disturbing when people become addicted. It's really, to me, a form of slavery.
The time has come to stop the sale of slavery to the young.
Mandatory, new, tough penalties for drug pushers. And we're beginning to win the crusade for a drug-free America.
But together we will win.
If you want to keep your freedom, you have to keep free of drugs.
Despite the lives lost in the war on drugs and the billions of dollars spent waging it,
No one sees a light at the end of the tunnel.
We've spent $500 billion since 1980 trying to make this a drug-free nation. Are we any closer than we were then?
There's a search warrant!
Some people say that the drug wars failed, we haven't won it, and we should give it up. That to me is like saying we've not found a cure yet for AIDS, so we should just give up the research. We don't give it up, because it literally will destroy us as a society to give it up.
This is now deeply embedded in the American cultural psyche. And I think the degree to which we're going to be successful at dealing with it is the degree that we can be honest about it, about drugs, how they've impacted people's lives, how they've shaped the world that we live in.
You've shared the ups.
You are my family.
And the downs.
You're gonna put this on national television! You!
At last, the time has come for Chris and Adrian to say, I do. It's the wedding we've all been waiting for.
She's the love of my life.
Please join us for this very special VH1 event. My Fair Brady, the wedding special, premieres this Sunday at 9 on VH1.